was supposed to be one of those uneventful days, the kind where nothing extraordinary happens. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, bathing Jake's small apartment in a warm, golden glow. The quiet hum of the city outside his window blended seamlessly into the background as he lay sprawled on the couch, absently flipping through television channels. Each flicker of the screen felt more monotonous than the last. He had no plans, no obligations. Just a simple, lazy day stretched ahead of him, where the most exciting thing he expected was deciding what to eat for lunch. Yet, as life often does, it had other plans. A faint gurgling sound interrupted the otherwise perfect quiet. Jake's eyebrows furrowed, his attention snapping to the bathroom door. For a second, he ignored it, thinking maybe it was just the pipe settling. His apartment wasn't new after all, and strange noises were part of the charm of living in an old building. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more ominous. Then came the unmistakable splash of water, hitting the floor, and Jake's stomach clenched with a mixture of dread and frustration. Not again. It wasn't the first time his plumbing had acted up. In fact, the pipes had been a constant nuisance ever since he moved in. They seemed to have a mind of their own, as if they enjoyed tormenting him at the most inconvenient times. Last time, he had foolishly tried to fix it himself, armed with nothing but a half-watched YouTube tutorial and a wrench he'd bought for a laughable price at a discount store. He thought he could handle it. He had been wrong, very wrong. Instead of resolving the issue, he'd only made it worse. What was supposed to be a simple tightening of a pipe had turned into a small flood that cost him more than he'd ever liked to admit. Ever since then, Jake swore he'd never touch those pipes again. With a heavy sigh, Jake sat up from the couch, running a hand through his hair. He stared at the phone on the coffee table, weighing his options. It wasn't like he had much of a choice. The memory of his previous attempt to play handyman was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Resigned, he grabbed his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling until he found the number of the plumber who had saved him last time. Mason. He hesitated for a moment before hitting the call button. Jake had only met Mason once before during the last plumbing disaster, but that one meeting had left an impression that Jake couldn't quite shake. Mason had been professional, efficient, and quick with his work. Everything Jake needed in a plumber, but it wasn't just Mason's work ethic that had stuck with him. No, it was something more primal, something Jake hadn't expected. The man had been striking, to say the least. In his early 30s, with a muscular build that seemed to challenge the fabric of his work shirt, his sharp features were softened by a thick beard that framed his face, giving him an air of ruggedness that had caught Jake off guard. He had barely said a word during the job, but his presence alone had filled the small apartment in a way that left Jake feeling uncomfortably aware of him. When he'd finished fixing the pipes, there had been a strange, fleeting moment where their eyes met. It was nothing more than a split second, but the intensity in Mason's gaze had lingered long after he left, making Jake question why he had felt such a pull toward someone he barely knew. Now, sitting on his couch with the phone pressed to his ear, Jake wondered if he'd feel the same thing again when Mason arrived. The call went straight to voicemail, and Jake left a brief message explaining the situation. He wasn't sure if Mason would be available on such short notice, but he hoped he wouldn't be stuck waiting for too long. The thought of water seeping into his floors was enough to make his anxiety spike. An hour passed, and just when Jake was about to check his phone again, there was a knock at the door. Jake's heart rate inexplicably quickened as he stood up. He walked over to the door, trying to steady himself, telling himself it was ridiculous to feel nervous. It's just a plumber, just a professional coming to fix a problem. Nothing more, nothing less. But when he opened the door and saw Mason standing there, toolbox in hand, Jake felt that familiar flutter in his chest. Mason looked almost exactly as Jake remembered. Broad shoulders straining against his shirt, arms thick with muscle, and a calm, confident expression on his face. His beard was neatly trimmed, and those piercing eyes, green, Jake realized, held the same intensity as before. "Hey, here for the busted pipe," Mason said, his voice low and steady. Jake nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "Yeah, it's in the bathroom again. Sorry for the short notice." "No problem," Mason replied, stepping inside with a polite smile. "Let's take a look." Jake led him to the bathroom, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened with each step. As Mason crouched down to inspect the situation, Jake stood in the doorway watching. There was something about the way Mason moved, deliberate, focused, and unhurried. His large hands worked skillfully as he pulled out tools from his box. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with each passing moment, and Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, though he didn't quite understand why. But then Mason pulled out something from his toolbox, a wrench. And not just any wrench. It was enormous, gleaming in the soft bathroom light. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. It was, in every sense of the word, a huge tool, and suddenly Jake couldn't help but feel a strange mix of amusement and something else, something deeper and more intense stirring inside him. He tried to stifle it, to push it down, but the sight of Mason's strong hands gripping the oversized wrench, muscles flexing as he adjusted his grip, sent a wave of heat coursing through him. He couldn't hold it any longer. A soft, involuntary laugh escaped Jake's lips, and Mason glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Something funny? Jake quickly shook his head, embarrassed. No, it's just, that's a huge tool. Didn't expect you to pull that out. Mason chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. Yeah, well, sometimes you need the right tool for the job. There was a pause, and Jake felt his face flush. Mason's words hung in the air, laced with a subtle double meaning that Jake couldn't ignore. The tension between them shifted, becoming something more tangible, more charged. It wasn't just about the plumbing anymore. Something had changed, and Jake wasn't sure how to navigate it. The silence stretched on as Mason stood there, the space between them suddenly feeling much smaller than it had a moment ago. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of confusion and desire. He knew he should say something, anything, to break the silence, but his tongue felt heavy, and his heart pounded in his ears. Mason, however, seemed unfazed. He glanced around the bathroom, then back at Jake, his expression thoughtful. "I'll have this fixed in no time," he said, his voice calm and steady, as if the moment of tension had never happened. Jake nodded, though he barely registered Mason's words. His mind was still reeling from the strange, electric moment that had just passed between them. As Mason returned to his work, crouching once more to finish the job, Jake found himself unable to look away. Every movement Mason made seemed deliberate, calculated, and somehow intimate. His large, powerful hands moved with ease as he tightened the pipes, his broad back flexing with each motion. Jake's thoughts drifted again, his imagination running wild as he watched Mason work. He couldn't help but notice the way Mason's shirt clung to his body, the way his muscles shifted and tensed beneath the fabric. There was something undeniably attractive about Mason, something Jake couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just his looks, though those certainly didn't hurt. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him, the way he handled each problem with ease and precision. Before he knew it, Jake's thoughts had wandered far beyond the realm of professionalism. His pulse quickened, and he felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but it was no use. The attraction was undeniable, and the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. Minutes passed, though, to Jake. It felt like an eternity. Finally, Mason stood up, wiping his hands on his rag once more. "All set," he said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Shouldn't give you any more trouble." Jake blinked, snapping out of his daze. "Oh, right. Thanks," he muttered, struggling to sound casual. "I really appreciate it." Mason's gaze lingered on Jake for a moment, and Jake could have sworn he saw a flicker of something in those green eyes. Something unspoken, something that mirrored the feeling swirling inside him. But just as quickly, the moment passed and Mason nodded, packing up his tools. As Mason turned to leave, Jake felt a strange sense of disappointment settle in his chest. He didn't want the moment to end, didn't want Mason to walk out that door and leave him alone with the confusing whirlwind of emotions that had been stirred up inside him. But what could he say? Jake's heart raced as he moved toward the door, hearing the knock that shattered the stillness of his apartment. There was something unnerving about knowing who was on the other side. His palms felt clammy, an absurd reaction considering it was just the plumber. He reminded himself of this fact, hoping it would steady his nerves. It was just Mason, here to fix the pipes. Yet the anticipation coursing through him felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the situation. Opening the door, Jake was immediately struck by Mason's presence, just as he'd been the first time. The man stood there with his toolbox in hand, a faint, polite smile on his face, though his eyes carried that same calm intensity Jake remembered. Mason looked as though he had just walked out of a construction ad, rugged, solid, and effortlessly masculine. The air between them seemed to shift the moment the door opened. The casual ease of the afternoon replaced by a current that Jake couldn't quite define. Mason didn't need to say much, and neither did Jake. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The silence that stretched between them wasn't awkward, but rather charged, as though both men were acutely aware of the underlying tension, but were careful not to acknowledge it. Mason nodded slightly in greeting, then stepped inside without hesitation, his broad shoulders brushing past Jake as he entered the small apartment. The scent of the outdoors clung to him, along with something else, something warm and musky that Jake had no business noticing but did anyway. As Mason moved toward the bathroom, Jake's eyes trailed after him, taking in the way his muscular back shifted beneath the tight fabric of his work shirt. Mason walked with a quiet confidence, every step purposeful and measured, and Jake felt an involuntary pull, as if the very space Mason occupied now demanded more attention. For a moment, Jake just stood there, rooted in place by a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. The bathroom door remained open as Mason crouched down to assess the problem, and Jake hovered nearby, watching. The space felt even smaller now with Mason in it, his large frame dominating the room. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, about the sheer efficiency with which he handled his tools. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, handled the pipes with a precision that seemed almost too careful for someone of his size. Each turn of the wrench, each adjustment, was deliberate and controlled, as though Mason was entirely in tune with the mechanics of the problem and how to solve it. Jake couldn't help but let his mind wander. He had never thought of plumbing as an art form, but watching Mason work, it almost seemed like one. There was something so methodical, so practiced in the way he went about his task. The quiet determination in his movements only heightened the intensity of the moment, drawing Jake's attention to every shift, every flex of muscle as Mason worked beneath the sink. The pipes had been an annoyance, but now, Jake found himself almost grateful for the opportunity they had created. For this unexpected moment, time seemed to stretch on as Mason continued to work in silence. The only sounds in the room, the faint clinking of tools, and the occasional creak of the pipes being adjusted. Jake realized he was holding his breath, caught up in the strange, unspoken tension that filled the small bathroom. He wasn't sure why it felt like such a charged moment, or why he was so hyper-aware of Mason's presence, but it was undeniable. Every time Mason shifted or reached for another tool, Jake felt a subtle pull, an awareness that extended far beyond simple curiosity. Mason paused for a moment, wiping the back of his hand across his forehead before returning to his task. His silence was companionable, almost comforting in a way, though Jake's heart hadn't quite slowed down since the plumber had entered the apartment. As Mason worked, Jake found himself wondering about the man beyond the profession. Who he was, what his life was like outside of these brief, utilitarian encounters. But those thoughts were fleeting, replaced quickly by the visceral, immediate reality of Mason's physicality, the closeness of his presence. At one point, Mason shifted his weight, adjusting his position as he worked under the sink, and for a split second, Jake's gaze was drawn to the exposed skin of Mason's lower back where his shirt had ridden up. It was a simple, insignificant detail, but it sent a jolt of heat through Jake's body. He quickly looked away, feeling a flush creep up his neck, embarrassed by the sudden, uncontrollable reaction. But Mason seemed completely unaware of the effect he was having on Jake, continuing to work with quiet precision, his focus unwavering. Jake, on the other hand, was all too aware of the undercurrent building inside him. He tried to distract himself by busying his hands, rearranging a few things on the counter, but it was futile. The proximity to Mason, the quiet intimacy of the space they now shared, was overwhelming. Finally, Mason stood, wiping his hands on a rag and turning to face Jake. His expression was neutral, calm, but there was something in his eyes, A flicker of something unspoken. A depth that Jake couldn't quite interpret but felt nonetheless. The air between them seemed to shift again, the atmosphere thickening with a tension that neither had directly acknowledged, but both could feel. Mason's presence filled the room, his physicality so near, so undeniably real. There was a moment brief but intense where their eyes met, and Jake felt his breath catch. It was as if all the unspoken thoughts swirling in his mind had somehow transferred into that gaze. Mason's eyes, steady and unwavering, held his for just a second too long before he turned his attention back to his tools, neatly packing them away. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. Jake felt an inexplicable urge to say something, to break the silence with a question or comment, but the words refused to come. Instead, he simply watched as Mason finished packing up, the plumber's presence still lingering heavily in the air. As Mason slung his tool bag over his shoulder, he glanced once more at Jake, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. And with that, he moved toward the door, leaving behind a quiet, palpable sense of something unfinished. Something that Jake couldn't quite put into words but knew would stay with him long after Mason had gone. The air in the apartment was thick with a tension that neither Jake nor Mason acknowledged directly. It lingered like a subtle, unspoken force, heavy and undeniable. As Mason worked in the bathroom, crouched low under the sink, Jake couldn't tear his eyes away. There was a strange energy in the room, an awareness that had crept in, uninvited, but now refused to leave. It wasn't the first time Jake had felt it, not with Mason, but today it felt sharper, more defined, as if it was begging to be noticed. Jake leaned against the doorway of the bathroom, his arms crossed over his chest trying to find casualness. The truth was, every small movement Mason made seemed to pull at something deep within him. It wasn't just the way Mason's muscles flexed beneath his shirt, or the quiet focus in his movements. It was the whole presence of the man, the way he filled the small space with such calm authority, as if this room, this moment, was entirely under his control. Jake's mind wandered despite himself. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected his thoughts to spiral the way they had, turning over and over Mason's every action, every subtle shift of his body. It was as if the longer he stood there, the harder it became to ignore the tension that had built between them. It wasn't something he could define. There were no words for this pull, this inexplicable attraction. It was just there, persistent and real. The sound of tools clinking together snapped Jake out of his reverie. Mason was methodically tightening something, his broad shoulders moving as he worked. Jake's gaze trailed down the strong lines of Mason's back, lingering on the way his shirt clung to his frame. The sight was almost mesmerizing in its simplicity. The way a man could make something as mundane as fixing pipes seem like an art form. The silence between them was palpable, charged with something deeper than the task at hand. Neither of them spoke, and yet the room felt full of unspoken words, of things neither of them dared say aloud. Jake could feel the weight of those unspoken thoughts pressing in on him, suffocating and exhilarating at the same time. He knew Mason could feel it too. He had to. There was no way to ignore it. Jake shifted his weight, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He could feel his heartbeat in his chest, fast and uneven, betraying the calm facade he was trying so hard to maintain. But it was impossible to ignore the way his body was reacting to Mason's presence. His skin felt hot, his breath coming a little too quickly, as if the very air in the room had thickened, making it harder to breathe. Mason moved with such purpose, his hands working the pipes with precision, his brow furrowed in concentration. But every now and then, there was a pause, just the briefest hesitation, where Mason's movements slowed, and he seemed to become aware of Jake's gaze. In those moments, the tension in the room swelled, almost unbearable in its intensity. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it was there, hanging between them like a weight that neither could lift. Jake found himself wondering what Mason was thinking. Did he feel it too, this strange pull? Or was it all in Jake's head, a product of his overactive imagination and the isolation of the moment? He tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on something else, but it was impossible. The air was too thick, The space between them two charged with the unspoken connection that had been building since Mason had arrived. As Mason stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, Jake's breath hitched. Mason turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. It was just a glance, fleeting and almost accidental, but in that instant, something passed between them. It was as if the entire room had shifted, the air crackling with an electricity that Jake couldn't ignore. His heart pounded in his chest, and his throat felt dry, as if all the moisture had been sucked out of the air. Mason didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His gaze held Jake's for just a second too long, and in that moment, Jake knew that the tension wasn't one-sided. Mason felt it too. The acknowledgement was there, unspoken but clear. Neither of them had to say anything. It was written in the way Mason's eyes lingered on Jake's for just a fraction longer than necessary, in the way his body seemed to pause, as if waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The moment stretched on, thick and heavy, until Mason finally broke the gaze, turning his attention back to the tools he had laid out on the floor. But the weight of that moment lingered, settling into Jake's chest like a stone. He didn't know what to do with it, didn't know how to interpret what had just happened. All he knew was that something had shifted between them, something that neither of them could ignore anymore. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged with the knowledge that something was brewing beneath the surface, something that had been simmering for longer than either of them had acknowledged. Mason's movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if he was just as aware of the shift in the air as Jake was. Every time he moved, every time his gaze flickered toward Jake, it felt like the air grew heavier, the tension more palpable. Jake's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. He didn't know how to break the silence, didn't know if he even should. The connection between them was so fragile, so undefined, and yet so intense that he feared saying the wrong thing would shatter it entirely. So he said nothing, letting the silence speak for itself, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. Mason finished packing up his tools, his movements careful and precise, but there was a slowness to his actions now, as if he wasn't in any hurry to leave. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, watching as Masonic methodically placed each tool back in his box. The silence between them felt louder than ever, the unspoken connection hanging in the air like a thread waiting to be pulled. As Mason straightened up, he turned to face Jake once more. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition. He didn't say a word, but in that moment Jake knew that Mason felt it too. The unspoken connection was real, undeniable, and it had been building long before today. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with possibility, with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. And then, without a word, Mason gave a small nod, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning, before turning and walking toward the door. Jake didn't stop him, didn't say anything, but as Mason left, the unspoken connection between them lingered, filling the room long after the door had closed. The silence in the apartment felt almost unbearable. Jake stood in the bathroom doorway, his mind spinning, heart racing, as he watched Mason finish up the last few adjustments to the pipes. There was something tangible in the air now, something heavy and unspoken that had been building since Mason had walked through the door. Neither of them had said much, but the silence between them was far from empty. Every glance, every subtle movement, seemed to deepen the tension, making the space between them feel smaller, charged with something neither of them acknowledged directly. Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, tightening his chest, making his pulse race. His thoughts were muddled, a swirling mess of confusion and desire, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't just the fact that Mason was here, in his apartment again, but the way everything seemed to shift whenever they were near each other. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for something, anything, to break it. Mason stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake's gaze followed him, lingering on the way his broad shoulders moved, the way his arms flexed as he packed up his tools. Every action felt heightened, more intense than it should have been. The quiet scrape of metal against the floor, the soft rustle of fabric as Mason's shirt brushed against his skin. It all seemed magnified in the stillness of the room. Jake's breath caught as Mason turned to face him, their eyes meeting for a brief, charged moment. Mason's gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was something there, something that made Jake's stomach twist with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in around them. Neither of them spoke, but the tension between them was palpable, so thick Jake could almost taste it. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one small step could send them both tumbling over, yet unsure if he had the courage to take it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it loud in his ears, drowning out everything else. Mason took a step closer, and Jake felt his breath hitch, his body going rigid with a mixture of nerves and something far more dangerous. There was something different in the way Mason moved now. Slower, more deliberate, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see how Jake would react. It wasn't a question. Not exactly, but it was close. A silent offer, one that Jake wasn't sure he was ready for but couldn't bring himself to deny. His throat felt dry, his mind racing as Mason closed the gap between them. It was a small distance, barely a few steps, but it felt monumental in the charged atmosphere of the room. Jake could feel the heat radiating off Mason's body now, the closeness between them amplifying the tension that had been simmering all afternoon. There was no need for words. Everything was laid bare in the quiet, in the way their eyes lingered on each other, in the way the air around them seemed to hum with the weight of everything unsaid. Jake could feel his pulse quickening, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, every nerve on high alert as Mason's presence filled the space around him. And then Mason reached out. It was a slow, measured movement, his fingers brushing lightly against Jake's arm, the touch so soft it was almost imperceptible. But it sent a jolt of electricity through Jake's entire body. His skin tingled where Mason's hand made contact, a warmth spreading through him that made it impossible to think clearly. Jake's breath hitched again, and for a moment he thought about pulling away, about retreating from the line they were both dangerously close to crossing. But he didn't. He couldn't. Something in him had already made the decision, even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. There was no going back now, not with the air so thick with possibility, not with the way Mason's touch seemed to ignite something deep inside him. The tension in the room reached its breaking point, and before Jake knew what he was doing, he found himself stepping closer, closing the small gap between them until there was barely any space left at all. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts, but he didn't care. All that mattered was the heat of Mason's body so close to his, the way their breaths mingled in the small, suffocating space between them. Mason's hand moved up Jake's arm, slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment, testing the boundaries of what they both knew was inevitable. His touch was firm but gentle, sending shivers down Jake's spine as he traced a line from his arm to his shoulder, and then to his neck. Jake's eyes fluttered shut for a brief moment, overwhelmed by the sensation, by the sheer intensity of the moment. It felt like time had slowed down, like the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving just the two of them in this small, charged space. When Jake opened his eyes again, Mason was watching him, his gaze dark and unreadable, but filled with something that made Jake's breath catch. It was as if Mason were waiting, giving him the chance to pull away, to stop before they crossed the line they both knew was just a breath away. But Jake didn't want to stop. Not anymore. Without thinking, without hesitating, Jake leaned in, closing the distance between them entirely. The moment their bodies touched, it was like a floodgate had opened. The tension that had been building all day finally broke, and suddenly, it didn't matter where they were, didn't matter how dangerous this was. All that mattered was the heat between them, the undeniable pull that had been drawing them closer with every passing second. Mason's hand cupped the back of Jake's neck, his fingers threading through his hair as he pulled him in closer, and Jake let out a shaky breath, his mind spinning as he leaned into the touch. It felt like a release, like giving in to something that had been simmering just beneath the surface for far too long. The air around them seemed to crackle with electricity, the tension shifting into something deeper, something far more profound. Jake's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts as Mason's grip tightened, his body pressing Jake against the doorframe with a firmness that sent a thrill through him. There were no words, no need for them. Everything they needed to say was conveyed in the heat of their touch, in the way their bodies moved together in perfect sync, as if this was what they had both been waiting for all along. Jake's hands found their way to Mason's waist, his fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Desperate for something to hold on to, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, lost in the intensity of the moment, in the heat and the weight of the unspoken connection that had finally burst free. It wasn't hurried, wasn't frantic, but it was intense. Each touch, each movement felt deliberate, like they were savoring every second, knowing they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But there was no regret, no hesitation, just heat, and the undeniable pull that had brought them to this point. Mason's breath was hot against Jake's skin, his lips grazing the edge of Jake's jaw, sending shivers down his spine. Jake let out a soft gasp, his grip tightening on Mason's shirt as he felt himself being pulled deeper into the moment, lost in the sensation and the overwhelming need that had taken hold of him. There was no going back now. The line had been crossed, and Jake knew that whatever happened next, it was only the beginning. The air in the room was thick with the remnants of their shared intensity, as though every particle carried the weight of what had just passed between them. For a moment, the world had shrunk down to the heat of their bodies, the electrifying closeness of skin on skin. But now, as the dust settled, a quiet realization crept in. The silence wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It was different, softer, filled with the unmistakable echo of what had just happened. Jake leaned back against the wall, catching his breath, the warmth of the moment still pulsing through his veins. His mind, though, was struggling to keep up. The weight of the reality of what they had just done was beginning to settle in, little by little, like drops of water gathering before a flood. His chest rose and fell with each shaky breath, but the clarity that followed wasn't as simple as he thought it might be. Mason had pulled back first, his hands still resting lightly on Jake's shoulders. But there was a shift in his expression now. His brow furrowed slightly, as if the gravity of the moment had started to sink in. His breathing was still uneven, his body still close, but his eyes betrayed something Jake hadn't expected. Hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Jake felt it too. The rush of heat, the undeniable pull, had consumed them both like a storm. But now the storm had passed, and all that was left was the aftermath. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but beneath the residual adrenaline, there was something else, the clarity that came in the quiet moments after passion, the questions that lingered in the back of his mind, waiting to surface once the frenzy had died down. Mason's hand slid from Jake's shoulder to his arm, the touch gentler now, more cautious, as if he were carefully retreating from the intensity they had shared. He didn't pull away completely, but Jake could feel the shift in the air around them, the weight of their actions pressing down, forcing them both to reckon with the reality they now found themselves in. The quiet stretch between them, not awkward but reflective, as if both were searching for some sense of understanding. Jake's thoughts raced in the stillness, the magnitude of the moment hitting him in waves. What had just happened felt seismic, like the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. The heat of their kiss, the way their bodies had fit together, it all felt too real now, too undeniable to ignore. But as the intensity faded, Jake couldn't help but question what came next. His body still ached with the memory of Mason's touch. His lips still tingled from the kiss that had all but consumed him. But in the space between breaths, reality settled in. An unspoken question lingered between them, heavy and unavoidable. What did this mean? Mason was the first to break the silence, though his words came not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate exhale. He ran a hand through his hair, a small gesture that spoke volumes in the quiet. His eyes flickered between Jake and the door, as if searching for something to ground himself, to pull him out of the haze they had both been lost in. Jake swallowed, his throat dry, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on him. His mind scrambled to make sense of the feeling swirling inside him, the heady mixture of desire and confusion that had tangled itself so deeply into the fabric of the evening. It wasn't just about what they had done. It was about everything that led them there. The tension, the unspoken connection that had simmered between them for so long, and the way it had all exploded in a matter of minutes. Mason's gaze softened as he looked at Jake, and for a brief moment, Jake saw something vulnerable in his eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A quiet uncertainty that mirrored Jake's own. Neither of them had expected this. Neither of them had planned for the line they had crossed, and now, standing in the aftermath, there was a palpable sense of fragility to the moment. Jake's thoughts raced, his heart still pounding in his chest, but there was no easy answer to the question that lingered between them. What had happened wasn't just an isolated moment of passion. It was the culmination of something deeper, something that had been building ever since Mason had first stepped into his apartment. But now that it had happened, what did they do with it? Mason shifted slightly, his hand falling away from Jake's arm. But he didn't move far. There was still a closeness between them, a connection that hadn't been severed, but it was more tentative now, as if they were both trying to figure out how to navigate the sudden shift in their dynamic. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts, and Jake could feel the tension building again. But this time it wasn't the same kind of tension that had driven them together moments before. This was the tension of uncertainty, of not knowing where they stood now that the line had been crossed. Jake's mind raced with the possibilities, with the implications of what had just happened. His body still ached with the memory of Mason's touch, but his mind was already a few steps ahead, trying to make sense of it all. The attraction between them was undeniable, but attraction wasn't enough to answer the questions that now hung in the air. What was this? What were they to each other now? Could they go back to pretending that nothing had changed, or had this moment irrevocably shifted everything? The silence stretched on, and Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. How could he articulate everything he was feeling? How could he explain the way his heart had leapt when Mason had touched him, the way he had felt so completely and utterly consumed by the moment? And yet, now that the moment had passed, he wasn't sure how to move forward. Mason's gaze flickered to the door again, and Jake's stomach tightened. Was Mason thinking of leaving? The thought sent a ripple of panic through him, though he wasn't sure why. Was it because he didn't want Mason to leave, or was it because he didn't want to be left alone with the aftermath of what had just happened? Either way, the thought of Mason walking out the door without any sort of resolution felt unbearable. Jake finally found his voice, though it was quieter than he expected. I didn't expect this, he admitted, the words hanging in the air between them like a fragile truth. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything Jake had been feeling since Mason had first stepped into his apartment. It's the tension, the attraction, the undeniable pull. They had all been there, simmering beneath the surface, but Jake had never expected things to escalate the way they had. Mason didn't respond right away, but his gaze softened slightly as he met Jake's eyes. There was something understanding in his expression, as if he too hadn't expected this turn of events. The vulnerability in his eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something like acceptance. For a long moment, they just stood there, caught in the quiet aftermath of their shared intensity, neither of them quite sure how to proceed. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened, but beneath the uncertainty, there was also something else, something quieter, but no less real. It was a connection, one that had been there all along but had now been brought into the light. They realized something important. There was no going back. What had happened between them had changed everything, and now they were both standing on the edge of something new. The air in the apartment had shifted once more, but this time, the tension that had once been sharp and electric had settled into something softer, more tangible. It was as though the weight of what had happened between Jake and Mason had transformed into a quiet understanding, a mutual recognition of the unspoken connection that had been lingering between them for much longer than either had admitted. Jake stood by the window, his gaze unfocused as he looked out over the city. The light from the setting sun was soft, casting a golden hue across the apartment, warming the walls and bathing everything in a serene glow. He could still feel the lingering heat of Mason's presence, even though they weren't standing close anymore. It was as if the air between them had stretched and relaxed, no longer fraught with unacknowledged desire, but filled with something more tender, something that felt as real and solid as the ground beneath his feet. He turned slightly, watching as Mason finished packing up his tools. The movement was familiar, yet different now, colored by the intimacy they had shared only moments ago. Every gesture Mason made seemed to carry a quiet weight, as if even the smallest motion was laden with meaning. Jake didn't know how to describe it, but he felt it in his bones. Something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone, but that also didn't need to be rushed. There was no urgency now, no need for words or explanations. The silence between them felt natural, like a pause between breaths. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded to be filled. Instead, it was a space where both of them could simply exist, side by side, knowing that they were no longer dancing around the edges of something unknown. Jake's thoughts drifted to what had brought them to this point. The simmering attraction that had built over time, the small glances and brief touches that had gone unnoticed, but had all led to this quiet moment of clarity. He hadn't expected this. Not the intensity of their connection or the quiet peace that had settled in afterward. But now that it had happened, there was no doubt in his mind that it was real. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion, nor was it something he could brush off as an accident. This was the beginning of something more, something deeper. Mason's presence filled the room, even though he was moving quietly, almost methodically, as he gathered his tools. There was a deliberateness to his actions, as if he was giving both of them the time they needed to process what had happened. Jake appreciated it. The space, the calm, the sense that there was no rush to figure out what came next. It was rare to feel such ease after something so intense, but there was a comfort in the knowledge that neither of them was pushing for answers they weren't ready to give. As Mason stood up, finally finished with his work, he glanced over at Jake, his expression softer than before. There was no tension in his face, no hesitation, just a quiet calm that mirrored Jake's own. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them without the need for words. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of relief that surprised him. He had expected to feel nervous, unsure of what to say or do now that they had crossed this invisible line. But instead, he felt grounded, as though everything that had happened between them had brought him to a place of quiet certainty. This wasn't just a moment, it was the beginning of something more, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt ready for it. Mason set his toolbox down by the door, his gaze lingering on Jake for a moment before he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I guess that's everything." Jake nodded, his own voice quiet in response. "Yeah, looks like it." It wasn't the words themselves that mattered. It was the tone, the shared understanding beneath them, the knowledge that they were both standing on the edge of something neither had planned for but both wanted to explore. The air between them wasn't charged with the same intensity as before, but there was still a current there, a quiet pull that neither of them could ignore. Mason didn't move toward the door, though. Instead, he stood there for a moment longer, his gaze never leaving Jake's. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at him, a question that didn't need to be asked because both of them already knew the answer. Jake took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them. He wasn't afraid of what came next, but there was a certain gravity to it, a sense that this wasn't something to take lightly. Whatever this was, whatever they were stepping into, it wasn't just about desire or attraction anymore. It was about connection, about the way they had both felt the shift in the air between them, and how they were both willing to let it guide them. The apartment was quiet, the soft hum of the city outside, the only sound breaking the stillness. Jake's gaze drifted to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were slipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. It felt like a moment of transition, like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. When Jake turned back to Mason, he saw that same recognition in his eyes. There was no need to rush, no need to push for answers or define what was happening between them. They both knew that this was just the start of something that would unfold in its own time. Mason's lips quirked into a small smile, and Jake felt his own mouth curve in response. It was a simple exchange, a shared moment of understanding, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. There was no pressure, no urgency, just the quiet certainty that they were both in this together. Whatever this turned out to be, Jake crossed the room slowly, closing the small distance between them. He didn't have a plan, didn't need one. When he reached Mason, he simply stood there, the space between them shrinking until there was barely any left at all. There was a warmth between them, not the fiery heat of before, but a steady, comforting warmth that filled the room. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Instead, they just stood there, close enough to feel each other's presence, the quiet hum of connection buzzing between them. Jake could feel his heartbeat steadying, matching the calm rhythm of Mason's breath. The world outside seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them in the soft glow of the fading sunlight. It was in that silence, in that shared moment of quiet, that Jake realized the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about the passion they had shared. It was about everything that came after. The quiet moments, the unspoken understanding, the beginning of something more. It was the knowledge that whatever came next, they were both ready for it, and that was enough. The day had started out like any other, with no hint of the shift that was about to happen. But now, standing here with Mason, Jake knew that things would never be the same. They had crossed a line, but instead of fear or uncertainty, all Jake felt was a quiet anticipation, a readiness for whatever came next. Because this wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was the start of something real, something worth holding on to. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt completely at peace with that.